So your favorite Torah teacher comes to town, and you gather all your friends together, and he gives you a free talk, and everyone has a good time, you have some good laughs, and you buy some of his books and tapes, and maybe you even give him a small donation to help him on his way, and then he leaves. Have you just fulfilled your requirements in Scripture? Have you just kept the Torah, or have you just broken Scripture? As we're going to see, you actually just broke Scripture. So some might be saying, what are you talking about? We had someone over. How is that breaking Scripture? Well, what we're going to see is that the Hebrew roots movement is not set up according to Scripture. There's structural problems in the Hebrew roots movement, and in fact, the Hebrew roots movement looks nothing like what Scripture says we are to do. In John chapter 14 and verse 15, Yeshua tells us, if you love me, then keep my commandments. And what we're going to find as we proceed in this study is the Hebrew roots movement is not keeping his commandments. In fact, we're set up on an entirely wrong foundation. Our whole structure and organization is completely wrong. Now, we can understand how we got here, but the question is, if we love Yeshua, the question is, are we willing to do what it takes to go from where we are now to get things set up on a right foundation? Are we willing to do things the way Scripture says to do them? Come along in this study, and we're going to see why Scripture says that we need to be organized on one single foundation of the apostles and prophets, and why we should not accept any other foundation. In Matthew chapter 28 and verse 18, Yeshua came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me, in heaven and on earth. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations, immersing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the set-apart Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. The question is, are we obeying Yeshua in this? If we love him, are we keeping his commandment? And if not, then do we in the Hebrew roots movement really have his Spirit? Well, we're not given to know any man's heart, but we're told that we are fruit inspectors. We're to inspect the fruit. And what we do is we can take a look, we can see the apostles laid down their lives in the first century to fulfill the Great Commission. They dedicated their entire lives to fulfilling the Great Commission because they had Yeshua's Spirit. That's how we know they had Yeshua's Spirit, is because they willingly did what their husband asked. The Great Commission was their purpose, and it's our purpose also. It's what our husband has asked us to do in order to please him. Yeshua says in Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 24 in the Beatitudes, he says, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. We want to build the house of our lives on the rock of what Yeshua has asked us to do. And the way we should do that is we should have the same vision for our lives as he has for our lives. We should be in unity. We should have one vision. We should be in onety with him. Whatever his vision for us is, that should be our vision for our lives. And Yeshua has told us he wants us to lay down our lives and go forth into all nations, immersing and making disciples, teaching them to keep all things he's commanded us. Proverbs 29 and verse 18 says, where there is no vision, the people perish. But if we've abandoned his vision, and now we have our own vision, I'll have a vision, you'll have a vision, someone else has a vision. So now instead of having one vision in onety, in unity together with him, now we have all sorts of different visions, which is why we have division. We haven't come together as one with his vision. And this is a problem. In the study, Unity through Acts 15, we saw how Scripture tells us we should come together. It gives us not just a purpose, but also a plan. It gives us a methodology, how the Ephraimites could come back into the nation if we would just start by obeying four main principles. We had to avoid idolatry, including deity denial. We have to avoid sexual immorality, including wrongful divorce. Of course, we shouldn't consume strangled or unclean meats, and we also don't eat blood. Then we can join the nation. Now, that's not a stopping point, it's just a starting point. Basically what it says is abstain from disfellowship offenses, abstain from sins that are going to get you kicked out, then you can come on in and study and become part of the nation. But notice we saw in that study, implied in the context is there must be leadership. In fact, Acts chapter 6 showed us that there was a whole separate clergy. The leadership must confer in Acts chapter 15, the so-called Jerusalem Council. We saw that the leadership conferred and came all together so they could be of one mind, and they could be in unity not just among themselves, but also in unity with Yahweh Elohim. And if the leadership does not confer, there will not be unity, just as there is not unity in today's times, because our leadership does not confer, because we're built on a wrong foundation. And as we progress in this study, we're going to see what that wrong foundation is, meaning where we are now. We're going to get to see where we need to go to and how we need to get there. But there's always been central leadership in Israel. Central servant leadership is part of keeping the Torah. In the Tanakh or Old Covenant times, the patriarchs ruled their family in central leadership. And as the nation grew, the patriarchs died, the nation became more than one family. Yahweh anointed Moshe, or Moses, to lead the nation. After Moshe, there was Joshua, and then in the period of kings, you had King David, and then King Hezekiah. But we're always told, in Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 18, we're told, you shall appoint judges and officers in all of your gates, in order to keep order within the nation. So there's a leadership structure. But yet today we say we're Torah obedient or Torah observant, but we don't want to appoint judges and officers like the Torah says to do. Well, maybe one reason is because although there's still central leadership, Yeshua instituted something different. We're told that Elohim instituted what's called the fivefold ministry. Talks about it in Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 11. It says, and he himself, meaning Elohim, gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, for the edification of the body of Messiah. Now remember, about approximately 1 person out of 40, as we already saw, is going to be part of the clergy, and the rest of the people are going to be the body that needs to be served. So this is a very important thing to understand. Either we're part of the clergy serving the body, or we're part of the body helping the clergy to serve us, and also to take the good news to the rest of the world, fulfilling the Great Commission. This is how we're being told that things are to be structured. Ephesians 4 and verse 13. We're to structure ourselves by the fivefold until we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of Elohim, to a perfect man. We're not perfect yet, so we should still be structured according to the fivefold, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of the Messiah. And the promise is that if we will structure ourselves in this way, then we will no longer be children, tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine, as we are today. We're taught this calendar and that calendar, some other calendar, and some other fine point of Torah, this Torah tidbit, that Torah tidbit. We are literally tossed to and fro and carried about by every wind of doctrine. It says, by the trickery of men, in the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. It says, but speaking the truth in love, we may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Messiah. And what this means is it's as if Messiah's head is suspended in the heavens, and it's given to us to raise ourselves up, to grow up in all things into him who is the head. This is the job that we have to do. We have to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, so to speak. And this is the means. The fivefold is our manner for doing that. Well, how do we support it? Verse 16 says, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share. In other words, each part of the body is supposed to contribute to the growth of the overall whole. Each part of the just like it is in a regular body. A mouth does the eating, but the food is not for itself. The food is to nourish the whole body. The eyes do the seeing, but that's so the body can see what the body needs to do. And in this kind of a way, every part of the body contributes to the overall health of the body, and thereby causes growth of the body for the edification, for the upbuilding, for the growth of itself in love, so we can all grow up in Messiah, so we can all come to the knowledge of a perfect man, so the body can raise itself up into its head. Well, earlier in Ephesians, the body is likened unto a single household, built on one single foundation, and it's also likened as a single temple, built of living stones that are knit together as one. In Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 19, it says, now therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners. You're no longer goyim. You're no longer Gentiles. He says, but you are now fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of Elohim. So we're being likened unto a house, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Yeshua Messiah himself being the chief cornerstone. What we need to see here is it's a one single foundation of apostles and prophets, with Yeshua Messiah being the chief cornerstone. It says, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a single, set-apart temple in Yahweh, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of Elohim in the Spirit. It's speaking here in the narrative about one single temple, one single household where all the bricks, all the living stones are knit together as one. And what keeps this household knit together as one, the mortar, if you will, is the desire to spread the good news and fulfill the Great Commission by way of the fivefold ministry. The mortar is that unity of vision that we have with Yahweh Elohim. Without that mortar, we become scattered. This is what Yahweh's well-ordered temple, or his well-ordered house, needs to look like. The evangelists conduct outreach, the pastors and teachers serve the people, and it's built upon a foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Yeshua himself being the chief cornerstone. What we need to understand here is the prophets and apostles are serving as a foundation. Why? Because the prophets have always fulfilled a role as a watchman, and the apostles also fulfill a prophetic role as that of watchmen. They help keep people grounded on the right foundation. Well, if we take a look at the Messianic movement today, we see no foundation of apostles or prophets. And for this reason, there's no corporate discipline, and all the ministers are free to operate and teach independently, which is why they teach so many things that just are not founded in Scripture. You could try to get people excited about coming back to the foundation of the apostles and prophets, but people don't really seem to think it as a priority in these days, which is why, if we take a look, it's similar to the days of Haggai. Haggai was a prophet in the time of the rebuilding of the temple after the people came back from Babylon. In Haggai's day, the people didn't really have a zeal. They didn't really care if Yahweh's temple got rebuilt. It just wasn't really a priority with them. This is why in Haggai 1, starting in verse 2, we read, "Thus speaks Yahweh of hosts, saying, This people says, the time has not come, the time that Yahweh's house should be built." We know that we are Yahweh's house. Then the word of Yahweh came by Haggai the prophet, saying, "Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, and for this temple to lie in ruins?" Yahweh's attitude here is, what are we doing spending time and money on ourselves when his house, his temple lies in ruins? If our focus is on ourselves, are we really worshiping him? Or are we not truly, really worshiping ourselves? We have to remember, Yahweh doesn't listen to what we say so much as that he watches what we do. So how are we spending our time? And how are we spending our money? Are we really placing the Great Commission first and foremost in our lives? Or are we just saying that that's what we're doing? You know, if we take a look around, people seem to have time and money for new cars, new trucks, new cell phones, new color TVs. They have money for trips here and there, go to a concert. They have money for all sorts of things. But do we have time for the Great Commission? Do we have money for the Great Commission? Is the Great Commission really what's first and foremost in our lives? If we're about rebuilding Yahweh's spiritual temple, let's just take a look. A physical temple has many needs. There's the altar has to be tended, there's showbread has to be baked, there's wood has to be chopped, water drawn, there's security, there's cleaning, there's building maintenance, administration. There's all manner of different needs that have to be taken care of. And the purpose, the reason all the tithes were given to the high priest was so the high priest had the money to make sure that all of the people were paid, to make sure that all the many, many things that have to be done to keep a temple functioning were taken care of. A lot of people seem to think that when they would come up to Jerusalem, they would just give their tithes to the priest who served them. But if you think about that, the system can't possibly work that way. If you or I, if we came up to Jerusalem and just gave our tithe to the first priest that we met, then who would do the supporting work of chopping the wood and baking the showbread and cleaning and doing the building maintenance? They couldn't do that. They would all have to quit and abandon their jobs and come out and try to be the very first person that the pilgrims met when they came up to come to Jerusalem. And this is precisely the way things are in the Messianic movement. The people are giving their tithes, their gifts, their offerings, their money to the people who are coming to their town, who are the pastors and the teachers and the evangelists. But they're not giving any support to the so-called high priest or the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, which Yeshua tells us we're supposed to be built on even today until we come to the unity of the faith. Now, to fulfill the fivefold in our day, back in temple times, they had certain needs. But to fulfill the fivefold, our body has certain needs. We need missions, we need schools for leaders and teachers, we need schools for our children, we need care for the poor, the widows, and the orphans, we need meeting halls, we need places of worship, we need leadership and administration. We can deny that we need these things, but there's no way to fulfill the fivefold without these things. And the reason that churches have historically succeeded, even though they've taught a wrong doctrine, the reason the churches have historically succeeded is because they've had a right structure. They're keeping the best practices of a right structure, even though they've had a wrong doctrine. And this is why the churches have gotten big and we are still small, is because they're following the right practice for big organization, but we're still disorganized with a multitude of visions, with division. And it costs us in our ability to serve Yahweh severely. We're not able to do our jobs for Yahweh because we're not willing to follow the structural principles that Yahweh has for us. Ephesians 4 and verse 16 tells us how it should be funded. It says, "From whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies," meaning each one of us is supposed to have within our hearts, to do what we can to help further Yeshua's ministry. If we truly love him, this would be something we should want to do. It says, according to the effective working by which every part does its share. In other words, this is what works. This is what's going to work, guys. If each one of us gives what we can, that's going to be an effective thing. That's going to be an effective working if we all do what we can, if we all do our share. And if we will do our share, that's going to cause the growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. If we will all give, we will no longer be children, but we're going to grow up into him who is our head. Now, 1 in 40 approximately is going to be a fivefold minister. So the clergy, so to speak, is going to be about a 40th of the people, and the body is going to be the other 39 to 40 people. And again, it's the job of the clergy to serve the body, and it's the job of the body to support the clergy and to help them carry the fivefold ministry to the rest of the world. Either you're called to the ministry work or you're called to help and support the ministry work. And this shouldn't be a hard thing. If you even mention the giving word, the G word, you get all sorts of angry, upset responses. But this shouldn't be a hard thing with us if we have Yeshua's Spirit. If we have His Spirit, we should want to carry the good news to the four corners of the earth. We should want to conduct the Great Commission by means of the fivefold ministry, because we're told this is the means by which we are to build Yeshua's body and temple. If we just think about it, even in secular terms, if we had an organization that we chose to support, Greenpeace or the World Wildlife Fund, the American Cancer Research, the American Red Cross, the Republican Party, if we believed in these organizations, wouldn't we want to willingly support them? Wouldn't we want to give to them? Because we'd want to help them succeed. So what about the Great Commission? What about the fivefold? Where does this rank on our scale? Is this something that's important enough? Let's forget about the T word. Let's forget about tithing. Let's just leave that aside. Does our heart lead us to want to further Yeshua's ministry? Does our heart lead us to want to obey Yeshua's fivefold? Do we have His Spirit? This is how we can know. We're fruit inspectors. Well, taking a look at the model that we have in John chapter 2 and verse 15, it says, when Yeshua had made a whip of cords, he's talking about the money changers, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. And what we see is that the only time in Scripture Yeshua became physically violent is when the people tried to sell things, when the people tried to merchandise things in His Father's house. Because merchandising profanes His Father's house. Now, we can understand that in government, isn't there a need to avoid a conflict of interest or the profit motive? And when our governors, when our public officials do things for their own vested interest, isn't that kind of greasy? Don't we dislike that? Don't we hate that? So when we hear about the profit motive in government, isn't that a problem? So what about in ministry? Shouldn't that be a problem as well? The fact is, independent ministers don't really work together unless they're all selling the word together. In Acts 15 and verse 6, we saw that the apostles and elders came together to consider the matter. But if we look at the Messianic version, it would read something like, now the apostles and elders came together to consider this matter and to sell some books and tapes to the people, because that's how they make their support. But that was too much work, so rather than considering the matter and rather than coming to one mind and one heart and seeking Yahweh's heart, they just simply sold their books and tapes to the people. Now, does this build a foundation of apostles and prophets? When I just come, give you a talk, sell you a bunch of books and tapes, and then leave? Have I built a foundation of apostles and prophets? Am I obeying Ephesians 4? Which I should know if I'm a leader and a teacher? These are questions we should ask ourselves. Ephesians 4 and verse 13 says we're supposed to be organized according to the fivefold until we all come to the unity of the faith, until we all come to the knowledge of the Son of Elohim and to be perfect men, until we raise ourselves up to the measure of the stature of the fullness of the Messiah. That's how we're supposed to be organized, is according to the fivefold. We shouldn't worry about selling books and tapes for profit. We don't see the apostles stooping and lowering themselves to that. Matthew 10 and verse 8 says, freely you have received, so freely give. So as a minister, whatever we receive from Yahweh, we freely pass to the other parts of the body. The mouth, when it eats something, it doesn't charge the rest of the body for the food. The stomach doesn't charge the rest of the body for digesting it, but all parts of the body work together as a whole for the betterment of the whole body. So when we as ministers receive something for free, we should freely give it and trust Yahweh to provide through those who love him and also want to conduct his fivefold ministry. If we just compare ourselves to the first century apostles, we know the apostles had Yahweh's Spirit because they dedicated themselves, they laid down their lives so that then they could carry out the fivefold ministry and the Great Commission. So if we compare ourselves to the apostles, would the apostles have shopping carts on their websites? Now, the sad thing about this is, I don't know any minister who isn't ministering today because he loves Yahweh. I think, in fact, I'm sure of it, they all love Yahweh. I've talked with some of them. I know men, they've slept in their cars. They've sold their houses for the sake of ministry. They've lost their wives and their families. They've lost it all. They have literally laid down their lives. They've lost their old lives because they love Yahweh and want to do his will. So don't tell me that they don't love Yahweh, because I know that they do. The only problem is that if they're not teaching the fivefold, if we're not operating on a joint foundation of the apostles and prophets, then we're teaching and we're operating in error. And we are keeping the movement from fulfilling its goal, because we're still supposed to be operating on a foundation of the apostles and prophets. We can't do the Great Commission and the fivefold ministry if we're not on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. So the apostles were organized by means of the fivefold ministry. And if we're doing something other than what the apostles did in the first century, then we're not doing what the apostles did in the first century. It's as simple as that. So if we're not doing what the apostles did in the first century, then we're not keeping Scripture. And that's a problem. So although these men love Yahweh, can you imagine, why are they selling books? Why are they not trusting Yahweh? Why are they not trusting Yahweh to provide through his people? Can you imagine the Apostle Shaul saying this? Now concerning the things of which you wrote me, you can find the answers in my next epistle, available for just $29.95. And if you act now, you get the free Ginzu knives. This is a true story. I was reading along, I was following another minister, he's a pastor, I got his newsletter. He was offering 50% off all items through the last day of unleavened bread. So is that something the apostles would do? Do we ever see the apostles anywhere putting a price tag on their works? This is not a small thing. People say, what you talking about? Why are you making such a big deal about it? The problem is that the book sales model gives ministers an incentive to tickle ears. And that's why they don't want to operate on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, because the apostles and prophets, their job is to maintain a sense of accountability and corporate discipline. But when you and I allow ministers to sell books, it encourages them to avoid the tough subjects in order to increase their profits. For example, one evangelist, I went to be there when he talked, in a big place, maybe 400, 500 people were there. He packed the hall. I said, brother, this is really great. How did you do this? How did you draw such a large crowd? And he said, I avoid the controversial subjects, which actually is okay for an evangelist if he was operating on a foundation of apostles and prophets. But when he's not operating on a foundation of apostles and prophets, doesn't it bring to mind 2 Timothy 4 and verse 3? Which says, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers. Brothers and sisters, that time is now. Ephesians 4 and verse 14 says that we should no longer be children. We need to operate on the fivefold ministry basis so that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about by every wind of doctrine. It says, by the trickery of men, in the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. Now, I'm not saying that these guys are setting out to consciously perform trickery, because I don't believe they consciously think that. I don't think they sit around and scheme together and go, how can we trick Yahweh's people into doing something other than the fivefold? I don't think they're doing that. I think these are guys who genuinely love Yahweh and want to serve him. The problem is they're just not disciplined. They're not being disciples because they're ignoring the fivefold. They're ignoring the foundation of the apostles and the prophets who would hold their feet to the fire, so to speak, and tell them, guys, I love you, you're doing great, but you need to be obeying the fivefold. They're just ignoring the fivefold, like that requirement doesn't exist, and the result is the Messianic mess that we have today. Because they're ignoring the apostles and prophets who would hold us all together and focus our unity of vision on his unity of vision, we have division. And this is why Shaul says that we're spiritual children. When a child is born, it's all about us. If we're hungry, we cry. If we're thirsty, we cry. If we need a change of diaper or something, we cry, and we expect someone else to come take care of our needs. But it's all about us. It's all about us getting fed. It's all about us getting nourished. It's all about us getting clothed and taken care of. Well, that's fine. Babies, that's appropriate for an infant. When someone is an infant in the Word, when they're small, that's where they should be. That's appropriate for brand new babies. But as children grow and get older, shouldn't they start helping out? Shouldn't they start perhaps doing some chores around the home? Well, what about with Yahweh's house? As we become older in the faith and we're no longer babies, shouldn't we start helping with the ministry as we can? Shouldn't we start giving and contributing so that we can grow up to become spiritual adults? By the time we're teenagers, shouldn't we be helping out with the chores? Shouldn't we be doing things to help further the fivefold ministry? Shouldn't we be doing something to help carry the Great Commission along and carry it forward? Shouldn't this be a joy to us? Forget the T word. Forget tithing. Shouldn't we love Yahweh? Shouldn't we love Yeshua in our hearts and eagerly want to assist and do all that we can, to do everything we can do? By the time we're adults, we need to be caring for others. We need to be caring for the babies and caring for the children. But our support has to come from somewhere. We need support in order to carry out the fivefold and the Great Commission. There has to be support for missions and for spreading the good news. If we love Yahweh, if we love Yeshua and believe him and want to follow the fivefold, there needs to be support for spreading the good news according to the fivefold. The problem is that what we see, so many people, again, we worship knowledge in this movement. With so many of us, it's all about, I want to get fed and I want to get fed. It's all about me learning knowledge. It's all about me. It's all about me learning. It's all about my head. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Brothers and sisters, we're being puffed up. We're being puffed up in knowledge, and we're not being built up in the love for our husband, Yeshua. We're not being built up to the point where we love him enough that we're willing to lay down our lives and we're willing to lay down our priorities to place his priority first, to help him spread his kingdom. We've got fed. It's like, do we care about anyone else? Do we care about Yeshua? So if we love Yeshua and if we have his Spirit, then are we eager to do all that we can to help spread his good news according to the fivefold? You know, grocery stores sell the people what they want. And some ministers are also going to give the people what they want if they're not held in check by the foundation of apostles and prophets. If we, the people, want the fivefold, if we, the people, want to obey Yeshua in this, then we, the people, will get the fivefold. But if we, the people, don't care about the fivefold, we won't get it. If we, the people, don't care about the Great Commission, it's not going to happen. This is what our husband has asked us to do. 1 Corinthians 3, starting in verse 11, says, "For no other foundation can any man lay than that which is laid, which is Yeshua Messiah, as the chief cornerstone." Now, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, some versions read stubble, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. Now, if anyone's work which he has built on it endures because he followed the fivefold ministry, he will receive a reward. But if anyone's work is burned because he was doing his own thing, he wasn't following the fivefold, he was selling books and tapes, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but so is through fire. So, which foundation do we want? Which foundation does Yeshua want? Does he want a foundation of book sales? Or does he want the foundation of the apostles and the prophets? It's our choice, brothers and sisters. We can do what Yeshua has asked us to do, and we can be pleasing to him. Or we can have more of the Messianic mess, with independent ministers, no corporate accountability, and no continuing no foundation of the apostles and prophets. It's interesting to look through history. We see that the first century Nazarenes were organized by means of the fivefold, and they write about it. The Catholic Church was also organized. They have a slightly different version, but they also had a type of a fivefold ministry. And when the Protestant churches broke away, they also had a fivefold ministry. Nazarene Israel today, just like the first century Nazarenes, we preach a fivefold ministry. But for some reason, the Messianics don't want it. They're not willing. Why is that? So place yourself in Yahweh's shoes just for a moment. Just imagine for the moment that you're in Yahweh's chair in his throne, and you're up in the throne room there in heaven, and you're looking down on earth, and you have 144 under-shepherds working for you, and they're all in a big open field, and you've got all these sheep that your 144 under-shepherds are tending to, they're taking care of. Now, just ask yourself, if you were Yahweh, what would you prefer? Would you prefer that your under-shepherds all got together and organized and worked together as one team and one unit and one spiritual fivefold, and they came together and said, okay, now you guys are all good at organization and administration, so you're going to take the prophetic, or you're going to take the apostolic role, and you guys are all good at being observers and inspectors, you're going to make sure the work is done right, so you're in the prophetic role, okay? You guys are good at this job, and you're going to do this, and you guys are good at cutting hay, so you're going to cut the hay, and you guys are good at repairing fences, and you guys are good at building barns. So they've organized themselves, they've come together, and they've figured out how can they work together to better serve you. That's how much they love you, is they've all come together and they've thought, okay, how can we come together to serve you according to your instructions the way you want? What would you think of them versus what would you think if they were just fighting and bickering and squabbling and they didn't want to work together and they cut up your pasture 144 different ways so they each could have their own portion of your sheep? Which group of shepherds loves you better? Which group of shepherds loves you more? This is a true story. So I was trying to work together with another minister. He was writing a calendar book, and I had a calendar book out. So I just sent him my calendar book. I figured he's another one of Yahweh's servants. We're all in this together. We're all trying to operate together. So I just sent him my books. He wouldn't send me his book. So I thought, we just discuss and talk things out, and maybe we can glean some insights, and we'll be able to work together to better serve Yahweh's people. But he wouldn't share his book with me. And I said, well, why is that? And he says, that's my secret, Brother Norman, and I'm not telling until after my new book comes out. And I just had to think, whose secret? Well, here's another true story. So the same friend, when his book finally came out, let's call him Minister B, he started selling Friend A's book on his website. Well, Minister B doesn't believe or teach what's written in this calendar book. He believes and teaches something different than what's written in this calendar book. Now, my question to you is, if Minister B doesn't believe or teach what's written in Friend A's book, then why does he sell it? What purpose is there? When we as ministers are taught to all be of one mind so that we can all speak and teach the same thing, when the example of Acts 15 is that the ministers have to come together as one so they can believe and teach the same thing, why is Minister B selling Friend A's book when he doesn't believe it? What possible motive could there be? Now, I'm not saying they're conscious of what they're doing. I'm not saying he's, sitting there scheming and giggling and this kind of a thing. I'm saying look at the fruit. Look at things through Yahweh's eyes. Are we doing what Yeshua commanded? Are we doing what the apostles did? Well, there's some other problems. If we take a look, serious structural problems. In Acts 15, the first two principles, we had to avoid idolatry, including deity denial, and we had to avoid sexual immorality, including wrongful divorce. But today we have ministers who teach against the virgin birth and who teach against Yeshua's deity. Very popular ministers. We also have a majority of our ministers who teach it's okay to divorce your wife for what Scripture calls any reason. Or if they don't teach that themselves, they're also working together with other ministers who've put away their wives unlawfully. I won't use names, but there's one minister who put away his wife in order to marry his mistress. His wife is now without support, and most people are fine with it. And they don't really care because they're learning things. So it's all about, in this movie, it's all about learning things. It's all about what we learn. It's all about what we know. Is that a Greek attitude, a Greek mindset? It's all about what we know, as opposed to the Hebraic mindset that it's not about what we do? Is this Torah, when we know we're supposed to do something but we don't? Wait a minute, I thought, to him who knows to do good but does not, to him it is sin. This is the Messianic movement. This is where we're at. We are guilty because we know what we should be doing, but we're not willing. Our heart is not willing to do what we know, what we've learned we ought to be doing. We're in disobedience to Yeshua's commandments. We're in disobedience to Yahweh's commands. Elohim is unhappy with the situation, according to his words, but yet we, the people, are fine with it. So my question, brothers and sisters, do we have Yahweh's Spirit? When we're fine with what makes Yahweh unhappy, brothers, do you like it when you're unhappy about something and your wife, she's fine with it. She doesn't care. You know it's wrong. You know it's an abomination. You know it's a problem. Your wife doesn't care. Your wife's like, yeah, sure, no problem, fine. I'm getting something good out of it. So we as his bride, how does he feel about us? Do we have his spirit when we're fine with what he tells us? We're just fruit inspectors. That's all we're doing. We're just inspecting the fruit. Here's this gentleman. He says, I know you put your wife away unlawfully, but I'll still come together and sell books with you because we want to be in unity, right? Brother, is that what the apostles did? In Hebrew, the word holy is the word kadesh. And the word kadesh means set apart. What it means is put the bad stuff away from you so the good stuff can be safe. Let's keep our wives, our children, our sons and daughters, let's keep them safe. Let's put sin outside the camp. That's always been Yahweh's way, even from the very beginning. Those who keep to Yahweh's way can stay inside the camp. And those who willingly choose to stray from Yahweh's way, they need to be sent outside the camp. So are we keeping Yahweh's way? Are we laying down our lives for the good news? Mark 8 and verse 35 tells us, for whoever desires to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the good news will save it. So, brothers and sisters, are we laying down our lives and living solely for the good news? Are we losing our lives for his sake? Do we have his spirit dwelling inside of us, such that we eagerly want to do all we can for our husband and for his good news? Shalom.